In 1324, a black African king named Mansa Musa walked through the city of Gao, carrying 24 tons of pure gold. That's not a metaphor. 24 tons. His caravan was so loaded with wealth that when he passed through Cairo on his way to Mecca, he gave away so much gold that he crashed the entire Mediterranean economy for 12 years. 12 years of economic collapse because one black man had too much gold. But here's what they never told you. 250 years later, the Golden Empire that king walked through the empire, that controlled all that wealth, was completely destroyed in a single day. Erased, burned, buried. And for 400 years, white historians pretended it never existed. They removed it from every textbook. They changed the maps. They rewrote history. Why? Because if you knew the truth about Gao, if you knew what your ancestors built in the Sahara Desert before Europeans even learned to wash their hands, you would understand that everything they taught you about Africa was a deliberate lie designed to justify slavery, colonization, and the greatest theft in human history. Your poverty isn't your fault. It was stolen. Your lack of generational wealth isn't because your ancestors didn't work hard. It's because they burned the cities your ancestors built and took every ounce of gold they had accumulated over 6 centuries. I'm about to prove it to you with names, dates, documents, and numbers that will shatter everything you thought you knew about your history. And I need you to stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will never see yourself, your family, or this country the same way again. Let me be clear about what you're about to learn. First, you're going to discover that from the year 1000 AD, centuries before Europe stumbled out of the Dark Ages, your ancestors in Gao controlled the largest and wealthiest empire in Africa. They ruled the entire Sahara Desert. They had universities when Europeans were burning women as witches. They performed eye surgery when European doctors were using leeches. They wrote hundreds of thousands of manuscripts about astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and law, while European kings couldn't even write their own names. Second, you're going to see exactly how Morocco used firearms and cannons to massacre 40,000 black warriors at the Battle of Tondibi on March 13, 1591, destroying in one morning what had taken 600 years to build. Third, I'm going to show you the deliberate, systematic way that European colonizers erased Gao from history books, burned libraries, changed the names of places, and constructed a completely false narrative that Africa had no civilization, no history, no contribution to humanity. And fourth, most importantly, you're going to understand how the destruction of Gao in 1591 directly created the wealth gap you're experiencing right now in 2025. The reason your family started from zero, while white families inherited wealth for generations. This isn't ancient history. This is the story of your stolen inheritance. This is why your grandmother struggled. This is why you rent instead of own. This is why the median black household has $24,000 in wealth, while the median white household has $188,000. They didn't work 8 times harder than you. They stole 8 times more from you. And after you see the evidence, you'll understand why we're not asking for handouts. We're demanding what's owed. So if you're ready for the truth, if you're ready to have your mind completely transformed, stay with me. Because what I'm about to reveal will set you free. Let me take you back to the year 800 AD. While Europe was drowning in what they call the Dark Ages, a group of people called the Songhai were building something extraordinary on the banks of the Niger River in West Africa. They chose a location that would become the most strategic trading spot on the entire African continent. They called it Gao. Now pay attention to why this location mattered. Gao sat at the crossroads between two worlds. To the north, The vast Sahara Desert stretched for thousands of miles, connecting to North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. To the south, the tropical forests held unimaginable wealth in gold, ivory, and kola nuts. Gao was the bridge. Every caravan traveling from the Mediterranean to the gold mines of Bambouk and Bouré had to pass through Gao. Every merchant bringing salt from the Sahara mines to trade for gold had to stop in Gao. The Songhai people who founded this city understood something that would make them rich beyond measure. Control the crossroads, control the wealth. By the year 1000 AD, Gao had transformed from a trading post into a powerful kingdom. In 1009, a king named Dia Kosoi officially made Gao the capital of the Songhai Empire, replacing the declining Ghana Empire as the dominant power in West Africa. And here's what makes this so important. When Dia Kosoi established Gao as an imperial capital, Europe was still centuries away from the Renaissance. Paris had maybe 20,000 people living in wooden houses, throwing their sewage into muddy streets. London was a collection of villages, but Gao was already becoming a cosmopolitan center of international trade, with stone buildings, organized markets, and a sophisticated government system. The wealth that flowed through Gao is almost impossible to comprehend by modern standards. Gold, mountains of gold. The Songhai Empire controlled the gold mines of West Africa, and at that time West Africa produced more than half of the world's gold supply. Think about that. More than half. European kings, Arab caliphs, and Asian emperors all needed West African gold to mint their coins, to fund their armies, to build their kingdoms. And it all flowed through Gao. The city controlled the salt mines of Tagaza in the deep Sahara, hundreds of miles to the north. Salt was called white gold because in the scorching heat of the Sahara and the tropics, salt wasn't just for flavor. It was for survival. It preserved food. It maintained health. In some places, salt was literally traded pound for pound with gold. The traders of Gao would send caravans north through the murderous Sahara Desert, 2,000 kilometers of scorching sand, where temperatures reached 50 degrees Celsius, where sandstorms could bury entire caravans alive, where one wrong turn meant death from thirst. These caravans of sometimes 2,000 camels would bring gold, ivory, leather, and enslaved people to North African cities. They would return with salt cloth horses and books. Books, remember that, because those books are going to become crucial to this story. By the 1300s, Gao had exploded to a population of 100,000 people. To put that in perspective, at the same time, London had maybe 40,000 people. Paris had less than 100,000. Gao was one of the largest cities in the entire world, and it was a black city in the middle of the Sahara Desert, ruled by black kings, enriched by black merchants, and protected by black warriors. The royal palace was decorated with gold. Not paint that looked like gold, actual gold, sheets of it covering the walls. When the king held court, he sat on cushions woven with gold thread, surrounded by guards wearing chainmail made from gold links. Foreign visitors from Cairo, from Baghdad, from as far away as India and China, came to Gao and wrote accounts describing the wealth they witnessed. One North African scholar wrote that in Gao gold was so common that people used it for everyday items. Another wrote that the king of Gao had so much gold in his treasury that if he released it all at once, the price of gold across the known world would collapse. Now here's where it gets even more remarkable. Gao wasn't just rich, it was educated. The Songhai people embraced Islam in the 11th century, and with Islam came a profound respect for learning scholarship and written knowledge. The kings of Gao established Quranic schools throughout the empire. They built mosques with libraries. They invited scholars from across the Islamic world to come teach in Gao and in nearby Timbuktu, which became the intellectual sister city to Gao's political power. By the 1400s, there were more than 150 Quranic schools operating in Gao alone. Students studied the Quran, yes, but they also studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, history, poetry, and philosophy. The city had a university system where scholars debated legal theory, astronomical observations, and medical procedures. There were hospitals in Gao where doctors performed surgeries, set broken bones, and treated diseases using medical knowledge preserved in hundreds of manuscripts. One of those manuscripts, which survive to this day, describes a surgical procedure for treating cataracts in the eye. The manuscript is dated to the 1300s. That's 200 years before European doctors figured out the same procedure. While Europe was in the grip of the Black Death, blaming Jews and witches for the plague, African doctors in Gao were writing detailed medical texts about disease transmission and quarantine procedures. While European kings were having their court astrologers read horoscopes, scholars in Gao were calculating the movements of planets and stars with mathematical precision. The greatest scholar associated with the Gao-Timbuktu region was a man named Ahmed Baba al-Masufi, born in Timbuktu in 1556. This man personally owned a private library of 1,600 books, 1,600 books, in his own house, on subjects ranging from Islamic law to algebra to medicine to poetry. He wrote more than 40 books himself on various subjects, and he wasn't unique. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of scholars in the Gao-Timbuktu region with personal libraries containing hundreds or thousands of manuscripts. Let me paint you a picture of what daily life looked like in Gao at its peak in the 1500s. Imagine walking through the city at dawn. The call to prayer echoes from the Great Mosque, a stunning building made of mud brick in the distinctive Sudanese architectural style, with wooden beams sticking out from the walls, like the quills of a porcupine. The mosque is packed with worshippers, men in flowing robes, women in colorful wraps. After prayer, the markets come alive. The gold market is where merchants weigh out dust and nuggets on precision scales. A man is negotiating for a shipment of gold coming up from the Bambuk mines 500 miles to the southwest. The price is calculated in salt bars, cloth, and horses. Nearby, a salt merchant from Tagaza has just arrived after a month crossing the desert. His camels are loaded with slabs of salt cut from underground mines where enslaved people work in brutal conditions to extract the white gold. He'll trade his salt for gold, for cola nuts, for leather goods, and he'll start the journey back north in a few days. In the scholars' quarter, a teacher sits under a shaded pavilion with 20 students gathered around him. They're copying a manuscript about Euclid's geometry, translating it from Arabic, adding commentary. One student asks a question about the proof of parallel lines, and the teacher draws diagrams in the sand with a stick explaining the logic step by step. In another part of the city, a doctor is treating a patient who was injured in a riding accident. He examines the man's broken leg, gives him something for the pain, a mixture of herbs that includes what we would recognize today as a natural opiate, and then sets the bone with practiced efficiency. He wraps it in a splint and gives the man's family instructions for care, all of which he's learned from medical manuscripts passed down through generations of African physicians. In the residential areas, families live in homes made of mud brick with thick walls that keep the interior cool, even when outside temperatures soar above 45 degrees Celsius. The houses have multiple rooms, courtyards with gardens where women grow vegetables and herbs, and rooftop terraces where families sleep during the hottest nights. Women in Gao have rights that would shock medieval Europeans. They can own property independently of their husbands. They can run businesses. There are female merchants in the markets trading cloth jewelry and foodstuffs. In the royal district, the palace of the Askia the title for the emperor of Songhai rises above the city. The Askia's tomb, which still stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is a massive pyramid-shaped structure, 17 meters tall, built entirely of mud brick. Inside, the royal family is buried with ceremony and honor. The current Askia, this is the 1500s, now rules over an empire that stretches from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to what is now Nigeria in the east, from the Sahara in the north to the tropical forests in the south. His empire covers more than 1.4 million square kilometers. That's larger than Western Europe. The empire is divided into provinces, each governed by a royal appointee who reports directly to the Askia. There's a sophisticated tax system. Merchants pay 10% of the value of goods passing through Gao. The treasury receives tribute from conquered territories. The army, 40,000 strong, is paid in gold salt and land grants. This is not a primitive society. This is a sophisticated, wealthy, organized civilization with systems of government, education, trade, and military power that rival anything in Europe at the same time period. Now I need you to understand two men who made Gao into the superpower it became, because understanding their achievements will make you understand the magnitude of what was stolen from you. The first man is Sunni Ali Bear. Born in 1442, Sunni Ali became king of Songhai in 1464, when the empire was still paying tribute to the declining Mali Empire. Sunni Ali looked at that situation and said no, not anymore. In 1464, he declared independence from Mali, and when Mali sent an army to put him back in his place, Sunni Ali destroyed them completely. He didn't just win a battle, he shattered the Mali army so thoroughly that Mali never recovered as a major power. Sunni Ali understood something about military strategy that made him nearly unstoppable. He built the first organized cavalry force in West Africa that could operate in both the desert and the river valleys. He also built a navy. Yes, a navy. A fleet of war canoes that controlled the Niger River, the main transportation route through the region. With his cavalry and his navy, Sunni Ali conquered territory after territory. In 1468, he marched on Timbuktu, the great center of Islamic learning that had been controlled by Tuareg nomads from the Sahara. The scholars of Timbuktu resisted him, calling him a tyrant, but Sunni Ali took the city anyway and incorporated it into the Songhai Empire. By the time Sunni Ali died in 1492, and yes, that's the same year Columbus sailed to the Americas, he had transformed Songhai from a regional kingdom into the largest empire in African history. His empire stretched 1,500 miles from east to west. He controlled the gold trade, the salt trade, and the most important cities in West Africa. But Sunni Ali was a warrior, not an administrator. The man who would turn Songhai into a truly sophisticated state was his successor, a general named Muhammad Turi, who took the title Askia Muhammad I when he seized power in 1493. Askia Muhammad was everything Sunni Ali was not. Where Sunni Ali was a warrior, Askia Muhammad was a reformer. Where Sunni Ali was brutal, Askia Muhammad was diplomatic. And where Sunni Ali built an empire through conquest, Askia Muhammad organized it into a functioning state. In 1495, just 2 years after taking power, Askia Muhammad did something that would establish his reputation across the Islamic world. He went on pilgrimage to Mecca, but he didn't go alone, and he didn't go poor. Askia Muhammad took 1,500 people with him, soldiers, scholars, servants, relatives, advisors, and he took 300,000 gold ducats with him to distribute as charity along the way. That's roughly 12 tons of gold. When his caravan passed through Cairo, the Sultan of Egypt hosted him as an honored guest. When he reached Mecca, he gave away so much gold in charity that his name became legendary throughout the Islamic world. The pilgrimage wasn't just about religion, it was about politics and diplomacy. Askia Muhammad met scholars, political leaders, and merchants from across the Islamic world. He invited some of them to return with him to Songhai to teach in the universities of Gao and Timbuktu. When he returned to Gao in 1497, Askia Muhammad began the most ambitious reform program in West African history. He divided the empire into 4 viceroyalties, each governed by a royal appointee with clear administrative responsibilities. He created a professional bureaucracy with ministers responsible for finance, justice, agriculture, and military affairs. He standardized weights and measures across the empire so that merchants in Gao used the same system as merchants 1,000 miles away. He reformed the legal system, establishing Islamic law as the foundation of justice, but adapting it to local customs and traditions. He built schools everywhere. In Gao, in Timbuktu, in Jenne, in dozens of smaller towns and cities. He paid teachers from the royal treasury. He encouraged students from across West Africa to come study in Songhai. By the early 1500s, the Gao-Timbuktu region had become the intellectual capital of Africa, attracting students and scholars from as far away as Cairo and Baghdad. Askia Muhammad ruled for 35 years, from 1493 to 1528, and during that time, the Songhai Empire reached its absolute peak of wealth, power, and cultural achievement. The treasury of Gao was overflowing with gold. The markets were flooded with goods from across Africa, the Middle East, and even Asia. The universities were filled with students. The mosques were packed with worshippers. The army was undefeated. Foreign visitors wrote accounts describing Gao as one of the wonders of the world. One visitor from Granada in Spain wrote that the king of Gao was richer than any European monarch. Another from Cairo wrote that the women of Gao wore more gold jewelry than the queens of Egypt. A merchant from Venice wrote that a single gold trader in Gao handled more gold in a month than all the goldsmiths of Venice handled in a year. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Here's what they erased from the history books. At the exact moment that Songhai was at its peak, at the exact moment that Gao was the wealthiest city in Africa and one of the wealthiest in the world, Europeans were beginning their colonial expansion. In 1492, the same year Sunni Ali died, Columbus reached the Americas. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India. In 1500, the Portuguese landed in Brazil. Europe was exploding outward, seeking gold, seeking trade routes, seeking colonies. And they knew about Songhai. They knew about Gao. They knew about the gold. European kings read the accounts of travelers who had visited Gao. They interrogated merchants who had traded there. They studied maps that showed the trade routes across the Sahara, and they wanted what Songhai had. They wanted the gold mines. They wanted the trade routes. They wanted the wealth. But there was a problem. Songhai was too powerful for Europeans to attack directly. The Portuguese tried to establish forts on the West African coast in the late 1400s, but every time they pushed inland, Songhai armies drove them back. The Songhai cavalry was too fast, too experienced in desert warfare. The Songhai knowledge of the terrain was too deep. Europeans couldn't penetrate the empire from the coast. So they waited, they watched, and they formed alliances with Songhai's enemies. The enemy that would eventually destroy Gao came from the north, Morocco. In 1578, the Sultan of Morocco, Ahmad al-Mansur, defeated a Portuguese invasion at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir. It was a massive victory that made Morocco the dominant power in North Africa. But the war had been expensive. Ahmad al-Mansur's treasury was depleted. He needed gold, lots of it, and he knew exactly where to find it. The gold mines of Bambouk, controlled by Songhai, the trade routes through Gao. But Ahmad al-Mansur had something that Songhai didn't have. Guns, lots of guns. The Moroccans had been buying firearms from European traders for decades. Arquebuses, early muskets that fired lead balls with gunpowder. Cannons that could blast through walls and scatter cavalry charges. The Moroccans had been training their soldiers to use these weapons, and by the 1580s, they had built an army that was technologically superior to anything in sub-Saharan Africa. The Songhai Empire had brave warriors, experienced cavalry, superior numbers. But they were still fighting with medieval weapons: spears, swords, bows, and arrows. They had some chainmail armor. They had shields. They had horses. But they had no guns. None. And that difference was about to cost them everything. In October 1590, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur assembled an army of 4,000 soldiers in Marrakesh. He put them under the command of a Spanish eunuch named Judar Pasha, who had converted to Islam and risen through the ranks of the Moroccan military. Every single one of those 4,000 soldiers was armed with an arquebus. They brought 8 bronze cannons pulled by horses. They brought thousands of pounds of gunpowder and lead shot. And on an autumn day in 1590, they started marching south across the Sahara Desert toward Gao. Think about what that journey was like. The Sahara is the most hostile environment on Earth. Daytime temperatures reach 50 degrees Celsius. The sand is so hot it burns through boot leather. Sandstorms rise without warning. Winds so powerful they strip skin from exposed flesh, sand so thick it chokes lungs and blinds eyes. There's no water, except at rare oases that are sometimes hundreds of miles apart. The Moroccan army spent 5 months crossing that desert. They lost 60% of their men to thirst, to heat stroke, to starvation, to sandstorms, to attacks by desert nomads. By the time they reached the Niger River in February 1591, Judar Pasha had only about 2,000 soldiers left. But those 2,000 soldiers still had their guns. They still had their cannons. And that was enough. News of the Moroccan invasion reached Gao in early 1591. The Askia at that time was Askia Ishak II, a descendant of the great Askia Muhammad. When Ishak heard that a Moroccan army was approaching, he mobilized the full military might of the Songhai Empire. 40,000 warriors, 10,000 cavalry on horseback, 1,000 war canoes on the Niger River, the largest army Songhai had ever assembled. The two armies met on March 13, 1591, at a place called Tondibi, about 40 kilometers north of Gao. If you're looking at a map, Tondibi is on the banks of the Niger River, in a flat area of scrubland and sand. It's the kind of terrain perfect for cavalry charges, which is exactly what the Songhai military strategy relied on. At dawn on March 13th, the two armies faced each other across the desert plain. On one side, 40,000 Songhai warriors, confident, experienced fighting to defend their homeland. On the other side, 2,000 Moroccan soldiers, exhausted from their desert crossing, outnumbered 20 to 1, but holding their arquebuses and standing behind their 8 cannons. Askia Ishak II gave the order to attack. The Songhai cavalry charged. 10,000 horsemen thundering across the sand spears raised war cries echoing across the desert. It should have been a massacre. 10,000 cavalry against 2,000 infantry should have been over in minutes. But then the Moroccans opened fire. The cannons roared first. 8 cannons firing simultaneously into the packed ranks of charging cavalry. The sound was like the world splitting open. The horses panicked. Horses that had never heard cannon fire before went insane with terror. They bucked, they reared, they threw their riders, they trampled each other. Then the arquebuses fired. 2,000 guns discharging lead balls into the confused mass of cavalry. The smoke was so thick that neither side could see. The noise was deafening, constant, overwhelming. For the Songhai warriors, it was like fighting demons. They couldn't see their enemy through the smoke. They couldn't hear orders over the sound of gunfire. Their horses were uncontrollable. Every time they tried to regroup and charge again, the Moroccans fired another volley. The battle lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of hell. By the end, 30,000 Songhai warriors were dead or wounded. 30,000. The survivors fled south toward Gao. The Moroccan casualties numbered in the hundreds. The Battle of Tondibi was one of the most lopsided military victories in history, and it happened because of one factor: technology. Guns versus spears. Cannons versus courage. And courage wasn't enough. Askia Ishak Thankun escaped with a remnant of his army and retreated south, abandoning Gao. 1 week after the Battle of Tondibi, Judar Pasha and his army marched into Gao without resistance. The greatest city in West Africa fell without a fight because there was no one left to defend it. What happened next was systematic destruction. The Moroccans looted the royal palace, taking every ounce of gold they could find. They seized the treasury, which contained the accumulated wealth of 6 centuries of Songhai rule. They stripped the gold decorations from the mosque. They took the gold jewelry from the markets. They rounded up the wealthiest merchants and demanded ransoms from their families. And then they turned their attention to the books. The Moroccans knew that the power of Gao wasn't just in its gold, it was in its knowledge. So they systematically destroyed the libraries. They burned manuscripts. They destroyed schools. They arrested the scholars. The greatest scholar in Timbuktu, Ahmed Baba, was arrested, chained, and marched across the Sahara to Morocco, where he was imprisoned for 2 years. His personal library of 1,600 books was confiscated. Most of them were never seen again. The Moroccans did the same thing in Timbuktu when they captured it a few weeks later. They closed the University of Sankore, the greatest university in West Africa, where thousands of students had studied for 200 years. They burned its library. Conservative estimates say that more than 100,000 manuscripts were destroyed in the years following the Moroccan invasion. 100,000 books containing the accumulated knowledge of West African civilization going back centuries. Books on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, law, history, poetry, philosophy. Gone, burned, destroyed. Why would an invading army burn books? Why would they destroy universities? Why would they arrest scholars? Because they understood something that took historians 400 years to rediscover. Knowledge is power. As long as the written record of African civilization existed, as long as there were scholars who could teach the truth, as long as there were libraries full of evidence of African achievement, the world would know that Africans were not inferior, not primitive, not lacking in civilization. The Moroccans wanted the gold, yes, but they also wanted to erase the evidence that Africans had ever been anything more than subjects to be conquered. And 400 years later, European colonizers would use the same strategy. Burn the evidence, destroy the records, erase the history, then rewrite it to say that Africa never had civilization, never had achievement, never contributed anything to human progress. That rewriting of history is the lie you were taught in school. That lie is what I'm here to destroy. Now let me show you the pattern. Because what happened at Gao in 1591 wasn't an isolated incident. It was the blueprint for what would happen over and over and over again. Whenever black people built wealth, whenever they created centers of learning, whenever they achieved anything that contradicted the lie of black inferiority. After the Battle of Tondibi, Morocco tried to consolidate control over the Songhai Empire. They sent more troops. They appointed governors. They tried to take over the gold mines of Bambouk, which had been the ultimate goal of the invasion. But here's what they didn't expect. The Songhai people refused to surrender. For 70 years, from 1591 to 1661, Songhai princes organized guerrilla resistance against the Moroccan occupation. They couldn't win conventional battles, because the Moroccans had guns, but they could ambush supply caravans. They could poison wells. They could attack isolated garrisons. They could make the occupation so expensive, so bloody, so exhausting, that eventually the Moroccans would have to leave. And that's exactly what happened. The Moroccans lost 40,000 soldiers in 70 years of trying to hold territory in West Africa. 40,000 men dead from combat, from disease, from heat, from starvation. They never managed to take control of the gold mines. The mines were too far south, too well defended by local resistance. And in 1661, Morocco officially withdrew from Gao and the Sahel region. They gave up. But by then, the damage was done. Gao was destroyed. Timbuktu was a shadow of its former glory. The Songhai Empire had fragmented into dozens of small kingdoms that fought each other instead of uniting against outside threats. The trade routes across the Sahara were disrupted. The universities were closed. The scholars were dead or scattered. The libraries were burned. And West Africa descended into 200 years of chaos and warfare that made the region vulnerable to the next wave of invaders. European slave traders. Here's the thing they don't teach you. The Atlantic slave trade didn't really take off until after the destruction of the Songhai Empire. In the 1500s, when Songhai was strong, when Gao was wealthy and powerful, Europeans couldn't penetrate into the interior of West Africa to capture enslaved people. The coastal kingdoms were strong enough to control the trade on their own terms. But after Tondibi, after the Moroccan invasion, destroyed the political unity of West Africa, after the region collapsed into warfare between fragmented kingdoms, that's when European slave traders were able to exploit the chaos. They would arm one kingdom to attack another. They would trade guns for prisoners of war. They would pit African states against each other and buy the captives. Between 1600 and 1800, 12 million Africans were captured and shipped across the Atlantic into slavery in the Americas. 12 million. And the destruction of Songhai in 1591 was one of the key events that made that possible. So when you trace your ancestry back, when you wonder how your family ended up enslaved in America, understand this. Your ancestors might have been citizens of the wealthiest, most advanced empire in Africa. They might have been scholars, merchants, craftsmen, soldiers. And a combination of Moroccan guns and European treachery destroyed their civilization and turned them into commodities to be bought and sold. That's not ancient history. That's your history. That's the story of how your inheritance was stolen. Now let me show you other examples, because the pattern repeats. In 1898, white supremacists in Wilmington, North Carolina, overthrew the legally elected biracial government of that city. Wilmington at that time was majority black and economically thriving. Black people owned businesses, held political offices, published newspapers. On November 10, 1898, a white mob of more than 2,000 armed men attacked the black neighborhoods of Wilmington. They burned the offices of the black newspaper. They murdered at least 60 black people, though the real number was probably much higher. They forced the mayor and city council to resign at gunpoint. They installed a white supremacist government. They drove thousands of black residents out of the city permanently, and those residents had to abandon their homes, their businesses, their property. All of it was seized by white people. And for 100 years, this event was described in history books as the Wilmington Race Riot, as if black people had rioted. In reality, it was a coup, a terrorist attack, an act of ethnic cleansing. It wasn't until 2006 that the state of North Carolina officially acknowledged what really happened. In 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood district known as Black Wall Street was the wealthiest black neighborhood in America. Black people owned grocery stores, restaurants, movie theaters, hospitals, schools, newspapers, law offices. Many of them were oil-rich landowners, Then, on May 31st, 1921, a white mob attacked Greenwood. They burned 35 city blocks to the ground. They murdered 300 black people. They destroyed 256 homes. They looted businesses and banks. They even used airplanes to drop firebombs on black neighborhoods. When it was over, 10,000 black people were left homeless. Their wealth, estimated at $32 million in 1921, money over $400 million today, was completely destroyed. And the city of Tulsa changed the fire codes immediately after the massacre, so that black people couldn't afford to rebuild. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, and for 75 years, the Tulsa massacre was erased from Oklahoma history books. 3 generations of Oklahoma students graduated without learning that it happened. In 1923, Rosewood, Florida, a prosperous black town with about 350 residents, black families owned land, ran businesses, lived peaceful lives. On January 1st, 1923, a white woman in a nearby town claimed a black man had assaulted her. It was a lie, but it didn't matter. Over the next week, white mobs from surrounding areas descended on Rosewood. They burned every building. They murdered at least 8 people, probably dozens more. They drove every black resident out of town permanently. The survivors fled into the swamps and were helped by sympathetic train conductors who smuggled them to safety. Rosewood was completely destroyed. The land was seized, and for 70 years the state of Florida pretended it never happened. It wasn't until 1994 that Florida officially acknowledged the Rosewood massacre and paid reparations to survivors. In 1919, Elaine, Arkansas, black sharecroppers organized a union to demand fair payment for their cotton crops. On September 30th, 1919, white landowners attacked a meeting of the union, killing multiple people. Over the next 3 days, white mobs with the support of federal troops hunted down black farmers across the countryside. Estimates of the death toll range from 100 to 250 black people murdered. Hundreds more were arrested, tortured, and forced to sign confessions. 12 black men were sentenced to death in trials that lasted less than an hour. And once again, the official narrative for decades was that black people had rioted, when in reality, they were massacred for demanding to be paid fairly for their labor. Do you see the pattern now? Every single time black people built wealth, built communities, built power organized for justice, white supremacist violence destroyed it. Every single time. Gao in 1591, Wilmington in 1898, Elaine in 1919, Tulsa in 1921, Rosewood in 1923. This wasn't random. This wasn't accidental. This was systematic. This was policy. They lied to you about Gao. They lied to you about Africa. And they lied to you about yourself. But the wealth and the wisdom of your ancestors left fingerprints in the ruins, in the manuscripts, in the maps, in the policies that followed. This is where we pull the mask off the cover-up. This is where everything starts to make sense. After Morocco shattered the Songhai army at Tondibi and marched into Gao, the first thing they did was grab the gold. That part is obvious. But the second thing they did tells you everything about their long-term plan. They went after the records. They went after the memory. They went after the story itself. Think about what it means when an invading army burns books. It costs them time. It costs them energy. It brings them no immediate gold, no quick profit. So why do it? Because knowledge is more dangerous than weapons. As long as the written record of African greatness existed in Gao and in Timbuktu, as long as ordinary people could point to a library, to a university, to a manuscript, and say, this is who we are, this is what we built, this is the depth of our science and our faith, then no one could justify enslaving them by calling them savages. So between 1591 and the early 1600s, Moroccan troops systematically destroyed West Africa's intellectual infrastructure. They burned libraries in Gao. They closed schools. They confiscated manuscripts. In Timbuktu, they descended on the University of Sankore, a university that had been teaching thousands of students since the 1300s, and they shut it down. Scholars were arrested. Ahmed Baba, one of the greatest minds of his age, was chained and marched across the Sahara, and his personal library of 1,600 books disappeared into Moroccan collections and European hands. Hundreds of thousands of other manuscripts were destroyed, tossed into fires, left to rot in abandoned buildings. Yet something miraculous happened. Ordinary families risked everything to save what they could. They hid manuscripts in mud walls, buried them in the sand, smuggled them along the river. For 400 years, generation after generation, passed down wooden chests full of fragile paper, in secret refusing to let the written memory of West African civilization die. In the early 2000s, when international teams finally began documenting the surviving Timbuktu manuscripts, they found more than 700,000 texts scattered in private collections. 700,000. That survival is a miracle of resistance. It proves that no matter how determined the invaders were, they could not completely erase what your ancestors created. But the suppression did not stop with burning buildings and jailing scholars. 2 centuries later, when European powers came to carve up Africa in the late 1800s, they took the Moroccan blueprint and turned it into official policy. French colonial rule over what is now Mali did not simply conquer land. It conquered memory. It conquered identity. When French troops seized control of the territory that had once been Songhai, they imposed a new name. They called it French Sudan. The word Songhai vanished from official maps. Gao was reduced to a dot on a colonial grid. French administrators banned the teaching of pre-colonial African history in schools. Instead, children were taught the history of France, the glory of French kings, and the myth that their true ancestors were ancient Gauls in Europe, not black rulers on the Niger. Imagine being a black child in Gao in 1910, sitting in a classroom built on the ruins of one of the greatest empires in African history, and having a French teacher tell you your real heritage is some white tribe in Europe you have never seen. That is not an accident. That is psychological warfare. That is educational erasure written into law. The textbooks used in colonial schools described Africa as a place without history. Philosophers in Europe, like Hegel, openly claimed that Africa was outside the march of civilization. 20th century historians repeated the same myth, writing that Africa had nothing but tribal conflict until Europeans arrived to bring order and progress. They either ignored Songhai completely or mentioned it in a single dismissive line. The libraries of Gao and Timbuktu were rarely mentioned. The universities were erased. The manuscripts, if shown at all, were treated like curiosities, not like the intellectual legacy of a global power. Meanwhile, European museums quietly filled up with the physical evidence of African brilliance. Manuscripts from Timbuktu, sculptures from West Africa, gold artifacts, ivory carvings. They were displayed in rooms labeled African art, often stripped of context, presented as primitive or exotic. The narrative was always the same. Europe was the center of history. Africa was peripheral. Europe had reason and civilization. Africa had superstition and tribalism. This narrative justified slavery. It justified colonization. It justified the continued extraction of resources and the continued denial of reparations. Now bring this forward to your own experience. Think about your school days. How many pages did your history textbooks devote to medieval West Africa? How many pages to the Songhai Empire, to Gao, to Timbuktu? Most likely, if they were mentioned at all, it was a paragraph or two. Meanwhile, you learned endless details about European kings, European wars, European inventions. You learned about the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, but not about the African empires that traded with those same Europeans as equals centuries before colonization. That gap is not a mistake. It is the direct descendant of the burning of Gao. When a system erases your history, it erases your claim to wealth, your claim to land, your claim to justice. If they can teach the world that Africa was always poor, then no one will question how Europe became rich. If they can convince you that your ancestors never built anything, then you will accept crumbs and call it progress. So let's talk about the numbers, because this is where the theft stops being abstract and turns into a bill. Remember that Gao controlled the gold trade for centuries. Conservative estimates suggest that West African mines under empires like Ghana Mali and Songhai produced hundreds of tons of gold per century. If Gao and the Songhai Empire were generating even 400 tons of gold per century in taxes, trade, and royal income, then over 400 years, from roughly 1200 to 1600, you are looking at a cumulative flow of at least 1600 tons of gold through that system. In modern terms, with gold prices in the tens of thousands per kilogram, that is trillions of dollars in value. That is just one region, one empire. Add in the value of the manuscripts, the intellectual property, the lost scientific discoveries, and you begin to see why calling this theft a tragedy is too small. It was an economic apocalypse for Black people, and an economic miracle for the systems that replaced them. Now take this idea of stolen base wealth and connect it to your life today. In the modern United States, the median white household has around $188,000 in net worth. The median Black household has about $24,000. That is an 8-to-1 gap. People will try to tell you that gap exists because of personal choices, because Black people do not save enough, do not invest enough, do not work hard enough. That is the lie. The truth is that white wealth has been compounding for centuries, built on top of stolen labor and stolen resources, while Black wealth has been repeatedly reset to zero by violence, redlining, discrimination, and historical erasure. Think about what generational wealth actually is. It is not just money. It is land passed down, businesses passed down, education passed down, connections passed down. Now imagine if Gao had not fallen in 1591. Imagine if the Songhai Empire had continued, modernized, industrialized, and then negotiated with European powers from a position of strength. The descendants of those Gao merchants would not have been chained in the hull of a slave ship. They would have been shareholders in global trade companies. The descendants of those scholars would not have been banned from reading. They would have been professors in universities that spanned continents. The descendants of those gold traders would not have been trapped in sharecropping. They would have been bankers and investors with centuries of capital behind them. If your family lineage traces back to West Africa, then the fall of Gao is not a random event on a timeline. It is the point where your ancestors' upward trajectory was violently cut off. It is the moment when your inheritance was diverted into European and Middle Eastern treasuries. When people say slavery happened a long time ago, ask them why they start the story at slavery. Ask them why they never talk about the 400 years of wealth and power that came before. Because if you include Gao in the story, if you include Songhai, then you can no longer tell a tale of Africans as naturally poor and dependent. You have to admit that something was taken, deliberately, systematically, and if something was taken, then someone owes. That brings us to reparations. People love to say nobody alive today owned slaves, so why should we pay? But that argument collapses the moment you understand how wealth works. The money your ancestors did not get from their labor did not vanish into thin air. It became somebody else's savings. It funded somebody else's house, somebody else's business, somebody else's college education. When Gao was looted in 1591, that gold did not vaporize. It went into Moroccan treasuries. It was spent on palaces, wars, art, and more trade with Europe. When European slave traders sold your ancestors in the Americas, they took the profits back to London, to Lisbon, to Amsterdam. Those profits funded banks, factories, railroads. They seeded the capital that built modern capitalism. When Black Wall Street was burned, insurance companies kept the money. When redlining kept your grandparents from buying a house in a white neighborhood, the appreciation on that real estate went to white families instead. That is generational theft. It compounds over time. Now imagine adding Gao's lost wealth to the accounting ledger. Imagine tallying not just unpaid wages from slavery in the Americas, but also the looted gold, the seized trade routes, the destroyed universities, the stolen intellectual property from West African empires. The number is beyond anything a single government has ever paid out, which is precisely why they fight so hard to keep this history in the dark. Because the moment you know the scale of what was taken, you stop arguing about whether reparations are deserved and start arguing only about the method and the amount. Reparations is not about making white grandchildren feel guilty. It is about closing a ledger that has been left open for 500 years. It is about acknowledging that you did not start from zero. You started from -100. It is about transforming the narrative from charity to justice. You are not begging. You are billing. You are not asking for favors. You are demanding payment. And this is not just about money. It is also about education. Right now in 2025, there are black children sitting in American classrooms being taught a version of history that still skips over Gao, still skips over Songhai, still skips over the fact that African empires had universities and libraries when Europe was illiterate. They learn about the pyramids in Egypt, often painted as non-black. They learn about Greece and Rome with pride and detail. They learn about the American Revolution, the Civil War, the World Wars. But their own ancestral empires get one line, if that. That educational robbery has consequences. A child who never sees their ancestors as builders, as rulers, as scientists, will struggle to see themselves that way. They will measure their people only by suffering, only by chains, only by segregation and resistance. That is why children can grow up proud of surviving yet still doubtful about their capacity to lead. The system has given them a story where their greatness is always reactive, never originating. Always in response to oppression, never as the authors of civilization. So the fight for reparations must include a fight for curriculum, demanding that Gao be taught in schools, demanding that Songhai Empire and the Gao-Timbuktu intellectual network be included in world history courses, demanding that every black child in America sees images of black scholars in the desert, black kings with gold crowns, black architects designing mosques and palaces centuries before the word America existed. Because when you restore that story, you restore something money alone cannot buy. You restore identity. This is where the emotional shift begins. Up to now, we have walked through the shock and the anger, the horror of the massacres, the relentless pattern of destruction, the suffocating weight of erasure. Now we move into something deeper: pride, power, calling. Because the point of telling you all this is not to leave you bitter, stuck in rage. The point is to hand you back the crown that history tried to keep from you. Listen carefully. You are not the descendant of helpless victims. You are the descendant of empire builders. You are the descendant of people who carved a city of 100,000 people out of the desert and fed them, educated them, protected them. You are the descendant of warriors who held off foreign invaders for 70 years in a war of resistance. You are the descendant of scholars who carried entire libraries in their heads and wrote treatises on law and medicine that Europe would not catch up to for centuries. You are the descendant of merchants who negotiated prices, calculated profits, and managed caravans stretching for miles across the Sahara. That means your relationship to poverty changes the moment you accept this truth. Poverty is not your natural state. It is an interruption, an injury, a wound. It is something done to you, not something you are. Your lack of land is not because your people never owned land. They owned entire trade routes. Your lack of capital is not because your people never understood money. They controlled the gold supply. Your lack of acknowledgement is not because your people never created anything worth acknowledging. They created cities that drew students from across continents. So when you look at your bank account, when you look at your neighborhood, when you look at your job, and you feel that weight of not enough, remember, Gao. Remember that your story did not start in chains. It started in a palace by the Niger River, in a bustling market filled with gold dust and salt blocks, in a library where a black scholar bent over a manuscript under the desert sun. And remember this too. You did not survive everything you've been through just to sit on this knowledge. There is a spiritual dimension here. Because if you are listening to this right now, if your heart is burning and your eyes are being opened, that is not coincidence. That is appointment. That is God tapping you on the shoulder and saying, now you know. Now do something. Your ancestors were not preserved through the Middle Passage by accident. Millions died in those ships. Many never saw land again. But some survived. Your bloodline survived. Your grandmother survived Jim Crow. Your grandfather survived being told he was 3/5 of a person. They survived lynching threats, sundown towns, segregated schools. They survived redlining that blocked them from buying homes in the neighborhoods that would later become wealthy. They survived being told they were stupid, ugly criminal, unworthy. They survive still in you. God did not bring your line through all of that to leave you ignorant of your own glory. God did not preserve those manuscripts through 4 centuries of war and neglect so they could sit in dusty chests forever. God is revealing this history now because there is work for you to do. You have a mission. That mission has layers. First, to learn, to unlearn the lies and replace them with truth, to dig, to read, to listen, to seek out the buried stories of Gao, of Songhai, of Mali, of Great Zimbabwe, of Benin, of every African empire that was pushed out of the spotlight. Second, to teach, to tell your children and grandchildren these stories before the world teaches them the lie, to print out maps, to show them pictures, to make this history part of your family, conversations, your church lessons, your community meetings. Third, to demand, to use your voice, your vote, your money, your time to push for policy changes, for reparations, for curriculum changes, for the return of stolen artifacts, for the funding of restoration projects in places like Gao and Timbuktu. Fourth, to build, to take the knowledge of who you are and let it inform how you move, how you start businesses, how you invest, how you collaborate, how you mentor, how you walk into rooms with your head high, knowing you are an heir of empires, not a beggar at someone else's table. You are part of a long relay. Your ancestors in Gao carried the baton of wisdom and wealth for centuries. They were tackled. The baton was thrown. Some pages burned, some gold melted, but pieces survived. Your ancestors on slave ships picked up what they could. Faith, music, stories, strength. They carried that baton through plantations, through reconstruction, through Jim Crow, through civil rights. Now that baton is in your hands. What will you do with it? Before we close, there is something you can do right now. If anything in this story has woken something up inside you, if you felt that mix of anger, pride, and clarity, then do not keep that feeling to yourself. Drop the word truth in the comments so people scrolling will see a wall of truth and know they are not alone. Hit that like button if you are done being fed lies about who you are. And share this video with at least one person who needs to wake up. A child, a friend, a co-worker, a pastor. Someone who has been carrying the weight of shame without knowing that their shame is built on stolen history. This is not about boosting an algorithm for the sake of numbers. This is about building an army of people who know who they are, whose they are, and what has been taken from them. When you share truth, you are doing more than moving a link. You are moving a line, a generational line. You are saying the story stops turning here. We will not let them erase us again. We will not let them bury Gao, bury Songhai, bury Black Wall Street, bury Rosewood, bury Wilmington, bury Elaine under silence. Every view is a mind opened. Every comment is a voice added. Every share is a seed planted. That is how we fight erasure in a digital age. One story at a time, one mind at a time. Now, if you are still with this message, then you have already done something powerful. You have stayed. You have listened. You have let this truth sink deep. And now it is time to seal it. Not just with emotion, not just with information, but with prayer. Father God, thank you for preserving this truth through fire and through darkness. Thank you for the hands that hid manuscripts in mud walls, for the elders who whispered stories when textbooks were silent, for the mothers and fathers who told their children, you are more than what they say. Thank you for Gao, for Songhai, for every forgotten city that your eyes never forgot. Thank you for the warriors who stood at Tondibi and refused to bow even when cannons roared. Thank you for the scholars who wrote by candlelight on the edge of the desert. Thank you for the ancestors who survived ships, chains, whips, and lies, and still found a way to sing, to pray, to hope. God, we ask for justice for those whose blood soaked that desert sand. We ask for justice for every life taken in Wilmington, in Tulsa, in Rosewood, in Elaine, in every town where black dreams were burned to protect white comfort. We ask for restoration of what was stolen, not only in money, but in memory. Restore our minds, Lord. Restore our sense of who we are. Restore the books. Restore the land. Restore the opportunities that were denied. Awaken your people. Awaken everyone who hears this, no matter their color, who truly loves justice. Break the power of lies over our minds. Let this truth spread like fire, but not a fire that destroys, a fire that illuminates. Bless every person listening who feels both the pain and the pride. Give them strength to carry this story into their families, their churches, their classrooms, their workplaces. Give them courage to demand what is owed without fear, without apology. Vindicate the memory of our ancestors. Let their names, their cities, their achievements be spoken with honor around the world. And as we move from knowledge to action, walk with us. Guide our demands, guide our organizing, guide our building, so that what we create in this generation will honor what was taken in generations past. In the name of Jesus, we say, let truth rise, let justice roll down, and let your people stand tall. Amen. Walk in truth. Demand justice. Remember Gao. Remember that you are the heir of a stolen empire, not the child of a cursed people. Until next time, keep building, keep teaching, keep fighting for reparations, and never let them erase us again.